Now, I've alluded to it before, but I want to take a final lecture to talk about art, education, culture, because perhaps the most significant achievement of the revolution, of building the new Mexico, which occurred under Obregón, Calles, and Cardenas, was the construction of a new culture. Jose Vasconcelos, you'll remember him, he was the young idealist that Obregón appointed as Secretary of Education. He was determined to bring education to the masses through a two-pronged effort. First, a tremendous effort was made to educate teachers and send them to the countryside, where more than 1,000 rural schools were established from 1920 to 1924. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history. The tone was secular, and teachers often encountered hostility from both the church, which was losing its educational role, and from rural families themselves, who often viewed the teachers as atheist outsiders. Nonetheless, the government continued to emphasize education, adding another 2,000 rural schools from 1924 to 1928. Of course, this effort clashed with the church, particularly in the 1920s under Calles, when education took a socialist turn. Math lessons calculated excess profits of factory owners, and geography classes examined imperialist exploitation. New history text focused on the struggle of the oppressed masses against capitalist, imperialist, and importantly, the church. A textbook published in the state of Tabasco in 1929 cautioned, quote, "The worker's ignorance is very dangerous, for it allows him to be victimized by the exploiters, priest and alcohol." Education continued to grow under Cardenas. He made, especially the rural school system, made considerable progress under Cardenas, but in the last years of his presidency, in an apparent bid to calm the clerical and conservative opponents of his regime, he soft-pedaled the so-called socialist character of Mexican education and backed off some of that more Marxist-sounding rhetoric. Now, I said two-pronged effort on the part of Vasconcelos. Part two of his plan was to educate the masses by making art available to them, and to do that by fostering the painting of murals in public places. It's kind of idealistic, thinking we're going to, change people by exposing them to giant public art, but it was a nice ideal. And the beginning of the mural movement generally is attributed to the paintings in the Escuela Nacional Preparatoria, National Prep School, which prepared students to enter the National University. It's sort of like a high school of the fine arts. And it was there that the three greatest muralists, Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, not to be confused with the revolutionary Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, I'm guessing at the name, made their first contributions to the movement. Now, this is an important point. Muralist painting of the Mexican Revolution, those are examples of something called social realism, class of art in the first half of the 20th century called social realism. It was an international art movement, and it refers to the work of painters, printmakers, photographers, filmmakers, who drew attention to the everyday conditions of the working classes and the poor, and who are critical of the social structures that maintain these conditions. And while the movement's artistic styles vary from nation to nation, it almost always utilizes a form of descriptive or critical realism. It's related to the realism that arose during the Gilded Age we've already discussed, but you can see how this would be very relevant to revolutionary artists in Mexico. All right, this is the work of David Alfaro Siqueiros. He was born Jesus Alfaro Siqueiros, but he changed his name to David, because he was an admirer of Michelangelo's signature work, the great statue of David. And he believed that his political and artistic ventures were inextricably intertwined. He was very Marxist. And although he worked as an artist for the government from 1922 to 1925, propagating Vasconcelos' mural campaign, he would eventually be imprisoned and then exiled for his communism. Not much Marxism in this work. This is probably his most famous work. It's called simply The Revolution. You certainly can see some indigenismo, but not a lot of Marxism. But his other works of his were very Marxist. Now, Jose Clemente Orozco was more critical of the revolution's bloody cost than Rivera. Rivera tended to idealize the revolution. Orozco was concerned about the horrific cost in death. He was also more fascinated by machines than Rivera. I like this painting, Gods of the Modern World, portrays both these ideas, the idea of capitalism and the machines and industrialization causing death. You could, in many ways, this would be a critical painting that could describe, really, in many ways, the theme of our entire 11th grade course. And as important as Orozco and Siqueiros are, the great muralist of the Revolution was clearly Diego Rivera. He was born in 1886. In 1907, he went to Europe, and his style became more experimental after 1909 when he moved to Paris, immersed himself in the avant-garde circles of Montparnasse, the hotbed area of Paris for young experimental artists. And from 1913 to 1917, under the influence of painters such as Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, Diego painted around 200 Cubist paintings. Although highly abstract, Young Man with a Fountain Pen clearly depicts a young man writing on a stack of papers. This looks like something, Picasso might have painted, and so he experimented with multiple styles. He also studied Renaissance frescoes in Italy, which would be relevant to his great murals back when he returned to Mexico. I put a picture of Frida Kahlo in here just because it was a convenient place to insert it. She was, of course, a great Mexican artist in her own right, and the longtime lover and eventually wife, off and on, actually, very tumultuous love affair with Rivera. In 1920, Rivera returned to Mexico and got involved in Vasconcelos's mural program. Rivera's work of the three, his work most connected with indigenismo. His work became emblematic in its worship of traditional folk elements of Mexican culture. You can certainly see that in this painting on the left. On the right, it's a very famous painting by him of Zapata. In 1922, Rivera participated in the founding of something called the Revolutionary Union of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors. It was sort of both a revolutionary art organization, kind of a union for artists. Later that year, he also joined the Mexican Communist Party. So like all of these guys, he was definitely revolutionary in his thinking and Marxist. In fact, in the autumn of 1927, Rivera visited Moscow, accepting the invitation to take part in the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. He was commissioned to paint a mural for the Red Army Club in Moscow, but in 1928, he was ordered out by the authorities because of involvement in anti-Soviet activities, and he returned to Mexico. So, what's going on? He apparently is a communist, but he was kicked out by the Soviets. I think probably he was accused of not, being un-Marxist, but being un-Stalinist, because in Mexico, in 1929, he was expelled from the Mexican Communist Party, but in 1936, he was instrumental in the defection of Leon Trotsky, who was sort of a one-time contender against Stalin, who had to leave the Soviet Union. He defected to Mexico, and he actually lived with Diego and his wife Frida Kahlo for a while. I mention this because this story will fit into something you're going to learn about next year. Now, coinciding with the revolution and its evolution of national consciousness was the development of popular music. And a lot of this is connected to the revolution. Much music was written about the revolution, and two song forms are worth noting. The first is ranchera. It's a genre of traditional Mexican music originally sung by only one performer with a guitar, and it dates to the years of the Mexican Revolution. It later became closely associated with the mariachi groups, which evolved in Jalisco. Drawing on rural traditional folk music, ranchera developed as a symbol of a new national consciousness in reaction to the aristocratic taste of the period. So it's sort of indigenismo plus liberty. It's a musical expression of this new, more egalitarian national consciousness. Traditional rancheras are about love, patriotism, or nature. The word ranchera was derived from the word rancho because the songs originated on the ranches in the countryside of rural Mexico. Now, the other important song form is the corrido, which should be, of course, the corrido, but I can't say that. Corrido music is popular narrative song of poetry form, a ballad. Various themes are featured in Mexican corridos, and corrido lyrics are often old legends, stories, and ballads about a famed criminal or hero in the rural frontier areas of Mexico. Some corridos may also be love stories. The corrido has a rhythm similar to that of the European waltz. So corridos, like rancheras, have introductory instrumental music and instrumental music in the middle between the stanzas of the lyrics. However, unlike rancheras, the rhythm of a corrido remains fairly consistent. Rancheras can be played at a variety of rhythms. Corridos tell stories, while rancheras are more for dancing. The song I played when I opened this unit was a corrido. Here's a picture of the sheet music to a corrido about Madero's triumphant entry into Mexico City for the first time. Now, the Revolution also produced an outpouring of literature. It was about 1906 to 1907 that real radical literature proliferated. Note the years. This is the years of the financial panic that really precede the Revolution, sort of the downfall of the Porfiriato. 1906 to 1907, this radical literature proliferates in which well-meaning, innocent, decent people are ruthlessly crushed by a vicious, gangster-like government. A number of intellectuals founded the Ateneo de la Juventud, which, I didn't pronounce that right, it means Athenaeum of Youth, sort of a collection of intellectuals. It was a collection of not only intellectuals, but mostly writers and philosophers. And most of the members were young and came to represent a new generation of Mexican scholars reacting specifically against the cientificos way of governing in the regime of Diaz. Important members included Jose Vasconcelos and this guy, Mariano Azuela, who was probably the most important literary figure of the Revolution. Azuela wrote the iconic book of the Revolution. It was based on his time, he was a physician, by the way, and it was based on his time as a physician in Villa's army. It's called Los de Abajos, which means the underdogs. It was the first great novel about the first great revolution of the 20th century. It's about a character named Macias, a poor, illiterate Indian. He has to join the rebels to save his family. He's courageous and charismatic. He earns a generalship in Pancho Villa's army, only to become discouraged with the cause after it becomes hopelessly factionalized. So the idealism gives way to sort of corruption and disillusionment. And at once a spare, moving depiction of the limits of political idealism, it's an authentic representation of Mexico's peasant life and a timeless portrait of the Revolution. It's the iconic novel of the Latin American experience and a powerful novel about this disillusionment of war in general. It is both a great example of Mexican revolutionary literature and an ideological account of the revolution itself.